Hello there, and welcome back. Picture a quiet kitchen in England, somewhere near the turn of the 20th century. The fire has settled into embers. The kettle has just finished its long, low whistle, and a tired factory worker lifts a small spoon and stirs it, almost without thinking, into a cup of tea. That spoon holds sugar, ordinary, forgettable, sitting on almost every table in the Western world by now. But if that same worker had tried to buy that same spoonful a few centuries earlier, it would have cost nearly as much as a day of hard labor. Go back further still, and it would not have been sold at all. It would have been locked behind an apothecary's counter, guarded like medicine, like something closer to gold than food. Tonight, we are going to follow that one small crystal across 10,000 years of human history. We will walk through jungles in the South Pacific, through ancient Indian workshops where sugar was first invented as a solid, through the courts of caliphs and the banquet halls of kings, across oceans in the hulls of ships, and into the darkest chapters of slavery and empire. We will watch it topple monarchies, fund revolutions, and quietly reshape the modern world. Right down to what sits in your own kitchen cabinet tonight. This is not a list of facts. It is one long, continuous story, and it begins, as so many strange stories do, in a place with no sugar at all. Before we drift into it, let us know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. And if you enjoy long, slow journeys through history like this one, settle in, get comfortable, and consider subscribing, so you never miss where the story goes next. Now, let us go back, far, far back, to a warm, wet jungle on an island most people have never thought twice about, long before there was a word for sugar, before anyone had ever tasted anything sweeter than wild honey or ripe fruit. There was a jungle, thick, humid, tangled with vines and thick canopy, sitting on an island in the far southwestern reaches of the Pacific Ocean, a place people today call New Guinea. This was not a place of empires or writing or cities. It was a place of small communities, hunters and gatherers moving through dense tropical lowlands, reading the land the way we might read a familiar room in the dark, by feel and memory rather than sight. And somewhere in that green tangle, around 10,000 years ago, long before the pyramids, long before writing itself existed anywhere on Earth, someone noticed a tall, thick grass growing wild near the rivers and clearings. It was not obviously food. It did not look like fruit. It did not smell sweet the way ripe mango or wild berries do. It looked, if anything, like an oversized reed, fibrous and tough, with a hard outer layer that gave no obvious hint of what was hiding inside. But someone, driven by curiosity or hunger or simple boredom, pulled a stalk from the ground, peeled back its fibrous shell, and bit down. What happened next is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy. From where we stand today, surrounded by candy and soda and 1,000 overly sweet things, to forget just how extraordinary that first bite must have felt. There was no refined sugar anywhere on the planet at that point. Not one grain of it. Not in any civilization. Not in any kitchen. Not in any market. Because there were no markets yet at all. The sweetest thing most human beings on Earth had ever tasted was wild honey, gathered at real risk from angry bees, or the occasional burst of a ripe fruit in season. And here, growing wild and abundant in the lowlands of a tropical island, was a plant containing something close to pure, concentrated sweetness, juice that did not need bees, did not need fermentation, did not need anything at all except a strong bite and a bit of effort to pull it free. It must have felt almost impossible. A grass that tasted like a gift. Word of a discovery like that does not stay contained for long, even in a world without writing, without roads, without any of the infrastructure we now take for granted. Communities talked. People traveled between settlements, traded small goods, married into neighboring groups, and shared what they knew about the land around them. And so, slowly, sugarcane began its very first journey, not as a crop grown deliberately in fields, but as something closer to a treasured secret passed from hand to hand across the islands of the Pacific. For thousands of years, that was the entire story. There was no refining. There was no boiling, no crystallizing, no attempt to turn the plant into something separate from itself. People simply pulled the stalks from the ground, peeled them, and chewed. It became something people carried with them on long journeys for a quick burst of energy. It became something offered as a gift between families, between villages, sometimes as a small gesture of goodwill, sometimes as part of larger ceremonies and rituals whose full meaning has long since faded from memory. In some island communities, sugarcane held a kind of quiet reverence, treated less like an ordinary plant and more like something worth honoring, something tied to celebration, to abundance, to the goodwill of the land itself. And yet, for all of that early affection, sugarcane in this era remained remarkably humble. There was no trade network moving it across oceans. There was no economy built around it. There was no sense, among the people chewing on its sweet fibers under the shade of a tropical canopy, that this plant would one day be worth more than gold, that it would one day fill the holds of great sailing ships, that it would one day be the reason millions of human beings were dragged across an ocean in chains. It was simply a sweet grass, a pleasant discovery, a gift from the jungle floor. But plants, like people, do not stay in one place forever, especially not when human beings are involved. Slowly, so slowly that no single person alive at any given moment could have noticed it happening, sugarcane began to move. It traveled with the great seafaring peoples of the Pacific, the skilled Austronesian voyagers who, over the following centuries and then millennia, pushed out across thousands of miles of open ocean in canoes, settling islands scattered like stepping stones across the water. Wherever these voyagers went, they carried with them the plants and animals they depended on, the things too valuable to leave behind. And sugarcane, this strange, sweet grass from the New Guinea lowlands, went with them, island by island, generation by generation. It drifted westward and northward, planted in new soil, tended by new hands, chewed by new mouths who had never once set foot in the jungle where it first grew. It moved through the scattered archipelagos of the Pacific and gradually crept into the edges of Southeast Asia, carried along the same slow currents of migration, trade, and settlement that carried language, number custom, and belief. There was no single dramatic moment in this stretch of the story. No conquering army, no famous voyage remembered by name. Just centuries of quiet, patient movement, a plant hitching a ride on humanity's endless restlessness. By the time it finally reached the edges of the Asian mainland and drifted toward the Indian subcontinent, sugarcane had already been traveling for thousands of years. Still nothing more than a sweet stalk to chew and share. Still completely unprocessed. Still tied entirely to the living plant itself. But that was about to change. And change in a way that would alter the course of human history forever. Because somewhere ahead, in the river valleys of ancient India. People were about to look at this same humble grass and ask a question that no one before them had thought to ask. Not simply, "How does this taste?" but, "What if we could capture that sweetness, hold on to it, carry it somewhere else entirely, long after the stalk itself had been left behind?" That question would turn a jungle snack into a technology, and it would be the first step on a road leading, eventually, straight to the quiet English kitchen where our story began. By the time sugarcane finally reached the Indian subcontinent, it had already been traveling, quietly and patiently, for thousands of years. It arrived not as a stranger, but almost as a returning traveler, settling into the warm, fertile river valleys that would come to define so much of early Indian civilization. The soil along these great rivers was rich, the climate generous, warm and humid in exactly the way this thirsty grass required. And the plant that had once grown wild in a distant jungle now found itself deliberately planted, watered, and tended by farmers who had learned, through generations of careful observation, exactly what this demanding crop needed to thrive. It was no longer simply found. It was cultivated, planted in rows, watched over season after season, folded into the rhythm of agricultural life alongside grain and lentil and rice. For a while, the story here might have simply repeated itself. People could have gone on chewing raw cane, enjoying its juice, treating it as nothing more than a pleasant, familiar crop, much as it had been enjoyed for thousands of years across the islands of the Pacific. Farmers likely did exactly that for a long stretch of early cultivation, growing it alongside grains and vegetables, eating it much the way their ancestors far to the east once had. But something different eventually happened in India, something that would quietly reshape the entire future of this plant, and in many ways, the future of the world along with it. Somewhere in these ancient river communities, farmers began to ask a new kind of question. Not simply how sweet the juice tasted, but whether that sweetness could be captured, held, and carried somewhere else entirely. They began to experiment, the way people do when a familiar object suddenly seems to hold more promise than anyone had realized. They crushed the cane, not just to release a mouthful of juice for immediate enjoyment, but to extract it in far larger quantities, pressing out the liquid hidden inside those tough, fibrous stalks with whatever tools and strength they had available. Then came the truly transformative step. They took that juice and boiled it, slowly, patiently, over open fires, watching the liquid thicken and darken as the water cooked away, leaving behind something that had never existed before anywhere on Earth in quite this form. A solid, a rough, dark, crystallized substance, formed by letting that thickened juice cool and harden. They called it khanda. It is a small word, almost unremarkable to modern ears, and yet it is worth pausing on, because that ancient word is the very root of a term we still use constantly today. Candy. Nearly every time a modern child asks for candy, without knowing it at all, they are echoing a word first spoken by ancient farmers standing beside boiling cauldrons of cane juice. Thousands of years ago, on the banks of Indian rivers. It is difficult to overstate how significant this single discovery truly was. For every single moment before this point, sweetness had been inseparable from the living plant itself. To taste it, you needed the actual stalk in your hand. You needed to be standing where the cane grew, cutting it fresh, biting into it before it dried out or spoiled in the heat. Sweetness was tied entirely to place and to season. But khanda changed everything, because for the first time in human history, Sugar could exist apart from the plant that made it. It could be poured into a container and sealed away, hidden from moisture and pests, protected the way a family might protect grain or precious oil. It could be stored for months without spoiling. It could be carried on the back of a cart, loaded onto a boat, and moved from one village to another, one kingdom to another, far beyond the reach of any sugarcane field. And anything that can be stored can be measured. Anything that can be measured can be owned, counted, hoarded, and eventually taxed by whichever ruler happened to govern the land where it was made. Sugar had quietly transformed from a fleeting sensation enjoyed in the moment into something closer to property, a commodity, a form of portable wealth that could sit patiently in a storeroom, waiting. This transformation, quiet as it seemed at the time, did not go unnoticed by the people living through it. Ancient Indian texts, written in Sanskrit and Pali, some of the oldest surviving written languages in human history, begin to mention sugar with a tone that suggests something far more significant than an ordinary crop. These were not casual references, tossed off in passing. They describe sugar carefully, almost reverently, as though the people writing about it understood they were describing something genuinely special. In a world where most food was consumed within days of being harvested, here was a substance that seemed to defy the natural order of decay entirely. It did not rot the way fruit did. It did not spoil the way milk did. It simply sat, sweet and stable, patiently waiting to be used. Naturally, in a civilization that had already developed sophisticated systems of medicine and healing, this stability and rarity did not go unnoticed by physicians either. Ancient Indian medical traditions, the deep roots of what would eventually be recognized as Ayurvedic medicine, began incorporating sugar directly into their practice. It was prescribed for headaches. It was used to treat stomach troubles and digestive weakness. It was even recommended, in certain contexts, as something close to a remedy for what ancient texts delicately referred to as failures of vitality and strength. Sugar, in other words, was not treated as a simple pleasure, something stirred casually into a meal without a second thought. It occupied a much higher, almost sacred position in daily life, closer to a rare and carefully guarded medicine than to something you might casually snack on between meals. To possess sugar was to possess something valuable, a kind of quiet status. To be given sugar, in certain contexts, was almost an honor, the sort of gesture remembered long after the moment itself had passed. For a long stretch of time, this remarkable invention remained largely contained within the Indian subcontinent, known and treasured locally, but still unfamiliar to the wider world beyond its own borders. And yet, nothing this remarkable stays hidden forever, especially not in a world increasingly connected by trade routes, wandering merchants and curious travelers. Slowly, faint rumors of this strange substance began to drift westward, carried along the same ancient routes that already carried spices, fine textile, and other treasures out of India and toward the Mediterranean world. The stories that reached those distant lands were strange enough to sound almost like myths. Travelers spoke of a plant, a simple reed growing straight out of the ground, that somehow produced something very much like honey, without any bees involved at all. To ears accustomed to honey as the only true source of concentrated sweetness in the natural world, this must have sounded almost impossible. The kind of story easily dismissed as exaggeration or fantasy. But it was not fantasy. It was sugar, real and solid and sweet, waiting patiently on the other side of a very long journey. for the day someone from that distant Western world would finally see it and taste it for themselves. And that day, it turns out, was not far off at all, because a young and ambitious conqueror was about to march an army east, deep into the heart of India itself, and his soldiers, exhausted and far from home, marching through unfamiliar heat toward the edge of the known world, were about to come face to face with the very thing those old travelers' tales had tried, and failed, to fully describe. What they found there would astonish them, and their own accounts of it would carry the story of sugar one step further west, toward Greece, and eventually toward Rome. In the year 326 before the Common Era, a young Macedonian king who had already carved his name into the ancient world led his army further east than any Greek force had ever traveled before. His name was Alexander, and by this point in his short, blazing life, he had already conquered Persia, marched through deserts, crossed mountain ranges, and toppled empires that had stood for centuries. But even Alexander, a man who seemed to believe there was no edge to the world he could not reach, found himself astonished by what his soldiers encountered along the banks of the rivers of northern India. Among his officers was a man named Nearchus, a naval commander tasked with exploring the waterways his army passed through, and it was Nearchus who left behind one of the most remarkable descriptions in the entire ancient world, a description that historians still quote today. He wrote of finding a reed, an ordinary-looking plant growing in thick clusters near the water, that somehow produced honey without the help of any bees at all. Read that line again, slowly, and try to imagine hearing it for the first time as a soldier who had grown up on olive oil, wine, and wild honey gathered at real risk from angry hives, a plant that makes its own honey. No stinging insects required, no careful, dangerous harvesting from a hollow tree. Used a stalk, pulled from the earth, offering up sweetness on its own. It must have sounded, to ears back home in Greece, like something closer to myth than fact, the sort of traveler's tale that gets repeated at a banquet and grows a little stranger with every retelling. And in a very real sense, that is exactly how sugar was treated once word of it made its way west. It became an object of wonder, a strange and marvelous curiosity discussed in the same breath as the other astonishing things Alexander's soldiers had witnessed in their travels through unfamiliar lands. But wonder alone does not build an industry. Geography had other plans. Sugarcane, that thirsty, heat-loving grass, simply could not grow in the Greek world the way it grew along the warm, well-watered plains of India, no matter how badly curious farmers might have wished otherwise. The climate was wrong. The rainfall was wrong. The entire ecosystem the plant depended on to thrive simply did not exist across the Aegean or the Greek mainland. And so, for all the astonishment it generated, sugar remained exactly what it had been the moment those first reports reached Greek ears. Arari, imported curiosity, something spoken of far more often than it was ever actually tasted. It never became a staple. It never found its way into the daily meals of ordinary Greek families. It stayed, instead, a story people told about the strange and distant edges of Alexander's conquered world. Persia tells a very different story, and a far more consequential one, sitting geographically much closer to India. With trade routes already well established long before Alexander's campaigns, the Persian world was in a far better position to actually receive sugarcane itself, not just rumors of it. Under the Achaemenid Empire, and later under the Sassanid dynasty that followed centuries afterward, cultivation of sugarcane genuinely took root across parts of the Persian world. Nurtured by a climate far more forgiving than anything Greece could offer, and where the plant took root, knowledge followed close behind, passed along trade routes that had connected Persia and India for generations already, long before either empire had ever heard the name Alexander. Persian scholars, physicians, and craftsmen began absorbing and refining the techniques for processing cane juice into something more stable, more valuable, more useful than raw stalks alone. Sugar began weaving itself into Persian medicine, prescribed by physicians who, much like their counterparts in India centuries earlier, recognized something in this substance beyond mere pleasure. It found its way into Persian cuisine as well, used carefully and sparingly in dishes prepared for those who could afford such luxury. A small sweetness layered into a culture already famous throughout the ancient world for its refined and elaborate cooking. Persia, in other words, became something India had already become long before, and something Greece never quite managed to be. Not merely a place that had heard of sugar, but a place that actually grew it, refined it, and used it. Rome, meanwhile, watched this unfold from a distance. Connected to these eastern territories through trade routes and diplomatic contact, but never through cultivation of its own. Since the same climate problem that had frustrated Greece frustrated Rome as well. When sugar finally did arrive in Roman territory, it arrived the way rare spices and exotic medicines so often did, in small, carefully measured quantities, sold not in ordinary marketplaces alongside bread and olive oil, but through pharmacies, dispensed the way a doctor today might dispense a costly, specialized medication, and the price reflected exactly that status. Historical accounts describe a single pound of sugar costing something close to a full month's wages for an ordinary Roman laborer. Sit with that figure for a moment. A common laborer working an entire month just to afford a single pound. Because it says almost everything you need to know about sugar's place in the ancient world. This was not a food. It was not something stirred casually into wine or sprinkled over bread the way we might do without a second thought today. It was an investment, a luxury reserved for those with real wealth, or a remedy prescribed only when illness demanded something extraordinary. Roman physicians turned to sugar specifically for certain ailments, most notably stomach complaints and troubles with the eyes, folding it into remedies alongside other costly, imported ingredients. It sat on the same shelves as rare herbs and precious oils, guarded carefully, dispensed sparingly, understood by everyone who encountered it, from the physician prescribing it to the patient paying for it, as something closer to medicine than to food. And here is perhaps the most striking part of this entire chapter. This was not a brief, passing phase. This state of affairs, sugar as an expensive, rare medicinal substance rather than an everyday food, persisted across Europe for centuries after Rome itself had fallen, long after the legions had gone home for the last time, long after the western half of that once mighty empire had crumbled into smaller kingdoms. Sugar remained locked away behind apothecary counters, priced far beyond the reach of ordinary people, treated with the same careful reverence it had received in Roman pharmacies centuries earlier. For hundreds of years, across the rise and fall of kingdoms, through wars and plagues and the slow reshaping of the European map, this simply did not change. Europe had no way to grow sugarcane on its own soil, no domestic supply to rely on. Nothing but a thin, expensive trickle of imports arriving from distant lands through a long, fragile chain of merchants and middlemen. If sugar was ever going to become something more than a rare medicine whispered about in wealthy households, that transformation was not going to happen in Rome, and it was not going to happen anywhere in the fractured kingdoms that followed its collapse either. It was going to happen somewhere else entirely, far to the south and east. A new civilization was rising, one that would soon take everything India had invented and everything Persia had refined, and turn sugar into something the ancient world had never quite managed to create. Not simply a curiosity, not simply a medicine, an industry, vast and organized, spreading across 3 continents, and about to change the very shape of how sugar moved through the world forever. When the armies and ideas of Islam swept across the Middle East in the 7th century, they did not simply conquer territory. They absorbed knowledge, gathering up the accumulated wisdom of every civilization they touched and carrying it forward, refined and expanded into something new. And among the many things absorbed in this way was sugar, still known at this point mostly to Persian physicians and craftsmen, still a regional specialty rather than a global commodity. That was about to change, and change dramatically, because the scholars, engineers, and merchants of this rapidly expanding Islamic world were about to do something no civilization before them had managed. They were going to turn sugar from a curiosity into an industry. Arab and Persian scholars, moving through territories that had once belonged to the Sassanid Empire, encountered the sugar refining knowledge that had already taken root there. Techniques passed down originally from India, adapted and improved by Persian hands over centuries. But rather than simply preserving what they found, the way a museum preserves an old relic, they studied it, tested it, and pushed it further. This was, after all, an era of extraordinary intellectual energy across the Islamic world, a time when scholars in Baghdad and beyond were translating and expanding on Greek philosophy, advancing mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, building some of the most sophisticated centers of learning anywhere on Earth. Sugar, it turned out, was about to receive the same kind of rigorous, methodical attention that scholars in this era brought to everything from optics to algebra. Treated not as a passing curiosity, but as a subject worth understanding fully, from the soil it grew in to the final crystal on a merchant's scale. The spread of cultivation that followed was staggering in scale. Sugarcane fields began appearing across the vast territory of the Abbasid Caliphate, stretching from Mesopotamia in the east all the way through Persia, into Egypt, and further still along the coast of North Africa. Historical sources from this period describe sugarcane growing in what they call every single village across parts of Mesopotamia, an almost unimaginable density of cultivation for a plant that, only a few centuries earlier, he had been a rare and exotic import, known mainly through second-hand travelers' tales whispered in Greek and Roman marketplaces. But growing sugarcane at this scale presented an enormous problem, one that any farmer standing in the dry, sun-scorched landscapes of Mesopotamia or North Africa would have immediately recognized. Sugarcane is a thirsty plant. It demands enormous quantities of water and consistent tropical heat, conditions that occur naturally in places like the river valleys of India, but that simply do not exist across most of the arid Middle East and North Africa. And this is where the story of sugar intersects with one of the true engineering achievements of the medieval world. Rather than accepting the limits their landscape placed on them, the farmers and engineers of the Islamic world built their way around the problem. They constructed vast and sophisticated irrigation systems, networks of canals, water wheels, and channels specifically engineered to bring water from rivers and underground sources to fields that had no business growing a tropical crop at all. This was not a small undertaking. It required genuine hydraulic expertise, careful surveying of land and water sources, coordinated labor across entire regions, and generations of accumulated engineering knowledge, all in service of forcing a demanding, water-hungry grass to thrive in landscapes that nature had never intended for it. Water wheels lifted river water up onto elevated channels. Canals branched out across fields like veins, carrying moisture to crops that would have withered and died within days under the natural rainfall of the region. In many ways, this irrigation infrastructure stands as one of the quieter, less celebrated engineering triumphs of the medieval world, every bit as impressive in its own way as the grand architecture and monuments so often associated with this era. And the effort paid off, spectacularly, because alongside this expansion in cultivation came an equally dramatic leap forward in refining. Craftsmen across the Islamic world developed techniques that produced sugar whiter, finer, and longer lasting than anything India had ever managed to create, even after centuries of its own innovation. This was not a minor improvement. Purity mattered enormously, both for how the sugar tasted and for how well it could survive long journeys to distant markets without spoiling or degrading. And craftsmen experimented with clarifying agents and repeated boiling and straining until they had transformed a rough, dark, unpredictable substance into something closer to the fine, pale crystals we might recognize today. Large, state-connected plantations sprang up throughout the region, often paired directly with dedicated sugar mills and refineries built specifically to process the harvest as efficiently as possible. Operations organized and financed in ways that echoed the scale of the state itself rather than the modest workshop of a single family. Sugar was no longer simply grown. It was manufactured. At a scale and with a level of organization the ancient world had never come close to achieving. From this thriving Islamic heartland, sugar began its next great migration, this time directly onto European soil for the very first time in history. Under Arab rule, sugarcane cultivation reached the island of Sicily, beginning sometime around the 800s, transforming that Mediterranean island into something Europe had never seen before. A place where this, once distant, mythical plant was actually rooted in local ground, tended by local hands. Not long after, cultivation took hold in Al-Andalus as well, the Arab-controlled territories of southern Spain, beginning sometime around the 900s. For the very first time, Europe was not simply importing sugar from some far-off, half-imagined eastern land. Europe itself, or at least the southern edges of it, was growing the plant. This shift mattered enormously, even if its full consequences would not become clear for centuries. Sicilian and Andalusian sugar plantations, complete with their own mills and irrigation networks built along the same principles pioneered further east, became living proof that this once distant, the tropical plant could be tamed and grown within sight of European shores. It meant sugar's story in Europe was no longer purely a story of long, fragile trade routes stretching back toward Asia. It had planted a real, physical foothold, however modest, on European ground. Medicine, too, advanced tremendously during this period, carrying sugar's reputation forward in an entirely new direction, one that would shape how Europeans understood sugar for centuries to come. Arab physicians did not simply use sugar the way earlier cultures had. They studied it with real intellectual seriousness, writing dedicated treatises specifically devoted to sugar's medicinal properties, its various forms, and its proper uses in treating illness. Sugar became, in a very real sense, a cornerstone of Islamic pharmacology, woven deeply into medical practice across the Arab world. And because ideas rarely stay contained within a single civilization for long, this medical knowledge gradually made its way outward. First, into the Byzantine world to the north, where scholars translated and adapted Arabic medical texts into Greek, and eventually into Latin Europe itself, carrying sugar's reputation as a serious medicinal substance deep into the heart of European learning. By this point, sugar had traveled an extraordinary distance from that first bite of wild cane in a New Guinea jungle so many thousands of years earlier, a journey spanning entire continents, empires, and languages, each one leaving its own mark on the substance and the word people used to describe it. It had become an industry, an engineering achievement, a branch of serious medical scholarship. And now, quietly, a crop actually growing on European soil. And yet, for all of this transformation, most of Europe still had almost no direct contact with sugar at all. It remained something known mostly through second-hand knowledge, through translated texts and the occasional rare import passed hand to hand at extraordinary cost, still fundamentally foreign to the vast majority of ordinary Europeans, who lived their entire lives, from birth to death, without ever once tasting it. That was all about to change, and change with startling speed, because a new kind of encounter was coming, one that had nothing to do with scholarship or trade caravans at all. Not through trade routes or translated manuscripts this time, but through armor and swords and holy war. European knights were about to march east into the Levant, into territory where sugar was not a rumor or a rare medicine locked in a monastery library, but an everyday, sophisticated reality, refined, sweetened, and woven into daily life. And what those knights were about to taste there would follow them home, cling to the European imagination, and refuse to let go for the next 700 years, setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually reach across an entire ocean. In the year 1096, the first great wave of European knights marched east toward the Holy Land, driven by faith, ambition, and the promise of glory. They called themselves Crusaders, and they came prepared for battle, for Siege, for the brutal realities of medieval warfare in unfamiliar terrain. What they were not prepared for was sugar, a substance that would prove, in the long run, to leave a far deeper mark on European history than most of the battles they actually fought. By the time these European soldiers arrived in the Levant, sugar was not some rare, half-mythical substance whispered about in travelers' tales. It was a fully developed, deeply woven part of daily life across the region, present in sweetened medicines dispensed by skilled physicians, in refined crystals sold in markets, in an entire established cuisine built around its careful, confident use, for men who had grown up in a Europe where sugar meant, at best, a rare and mysterious pharmacy item locked away and priced far beyond ordinary reach. Encountering it here, woven so completely into everyday life that local merchants sold it in open markets and physicians dispensed it without ceremony, must have felt almost disorienting. This was not a rumor anymore. This was a civilization that had spent centuries perfecting something Europe barely understood existed. They tasted it, and having tasted it, they could not simply leave it behind. Crusaders began carrying sugar home with them, packed carefully alongside religious relics, alongside spoils of war, alongside whatever treasures a knight might bring back to justify years spent fighting far from home. Word of it spread quickly, carried home in letters, in the boastful stories of returning soldiers, in the simple fact that anyone who tasted it once seemed unable to stop talking about it. moving through European courts and monasteries with the kind of momentum reserved for genuinely rare discoveries. This was, travelers insisted, among the most precious products a person could possess, worthy of mention in the same breath as gold, as silk, as anything truly rare and valuable. A reputation was forming, one that would define sugar's place in European society for the next several centuries. But someone needed to actually manage the flow of this newly desired treasure, moving it reliably from the eastern Mediterranean into the heart of Europe. And into that role stepped Venice, a city built almost entirely on trade, sitting at the crossroads where east met west with remarkable geographic convenience. Venetian merchants, sharp-eyed and endlessly practical, recognized an opportunity when they saw one, and they moved decisively to seize it, understanding almost immediately that whoever controlled this trade would control something far more valuable than the sugar itself. They began importing raw sugar from ports across the eastern Mediterranean, then refining it themselves in facilities built specifically for that purpose. Rather than simply reselling an imported finished product, this gave them extraordinary control over both quality and price, and it meant every stage of the process. From the moment raw sugar landed on Venetian docks to the moment a refined loaf reached a customer in Paris or London, passed through hands answerable to the city itself. From these refineries, Venetian sugar spread outward across the entire European continent, carried along established trade routes into France, into England, into the German states, into every court and city wealthy enough to afford it. And Venice, understanding its own leverage perfectly well, charged accordingly. The markups were staggering, reflecting not just the genuine cost and risk of the trade, but the simple fact that, for roughly 2 centuries, Venice held something remarkably close to a complete monopoly on European sugar. If you wanted sugar anywhere on the continent, in nearly every case, your sugar had passed through Venetian hands first, and Venetian merchants had taken their considerable share of the profit along the way. And what profit it was! Venice's sugar trade became one of the great commercial engines of the medieval Mediterranean world, funding the construction of grand palaces, financing further trade expeditions, cementing the city's reputation as one of the wealthiest and most powerful trading powers in Europe. All of it, in significant part, built on a substance most ordinary Europeans would never once taste in their entire lives. A strange irony sitting quietly at the heart of one of the era's great commercial success stories. Because make no mistake, sugar during this era was not food in any meaningful, everyday sense. It was status. In the great courts of medieval Europe, sugar took on a role that might seem strange to modern eyes, treated less like an ingredient and more like a precious metal, something to be displayed rather than simply consumed. Wealthy households and royal kitchens commissioned elaborate sugar sculptures, intricate centerpieces molded and shaped for grand banquets, designed not primarily to be eaten, but to be seen, admired, and remembered as a demonstration of the host's almost unimaginable wealth. Royal treasuries kept careful, detailed inventories of their sugar holdings, tracking quantities the way a modern government might track reserves of gold, recording how many pounds sat in storage, how much had been spent, and how much remained. Because in a very real economic sense, that is precisely what sugar represented: a compact, valuable, storable form of wealth that happened to also taste sweet. Perhaps no single moment captures this reality more vividly, more concretely, than the wedding feast of King Henry III of England in the year 1236, an event historians still return to whenever they want to illustrate exactly what sugar meant to medieval Europe. Historical records from the royal household describe a purchase of over 300 pounds of sugar for this single celebration, an almost unimaginable quantity given the substance's staggering cost. To put that purchase in perspective, historians estimate its value exceeded an entire year's income for a knight, a man of genuine social standing and means. Imagine that. A single wedding feast consuming, in sugar alone, more wealth than a knight might earn across an entire year of service. That is not a purchase. That is a statement, a deliberate, calculated display of royal power and prestige, communicated through spoonfuls of white crystal. Outside the grandeur of royal courts, sugar occupied a very different but equally telling space, locked carefully behind the counters of medieval apothecaries. There, it sat alongside opium and other rare, carefully guarded spices, treated with the same caution and respect reserved for genuinely powerful medicines. Physicians prescribed sugar for coughs, for what they described as melancholy, for a wide range of general ailments believed to benefit from its sweet, warming properties. This was pharmacy, not pantry, a distinction that would have been obvious to anyone alive at the time, though it seems almost backwards to us today. You did not casually reach for sugar the way you might reach for salt or flour. You obtained it deliberately, through a physician or apothecary, usually because illness, or the desire to display extraordinary wealth, demanded it. And underlying all of this, quietly shaping every single transaction, every royal purchase, every carefully measured apothecary dose, sat one simple, stubborn geographic fact that no amount of wealth or ambition could overcome. Sugarcane cannot grow in the cold, wet climate of northern Europe. Every single grain consumed anywhere across England, France, or the German states depended entirely on a long, fragile chain of trade stretching back toward the Islamic world and passing, almost without exception, through Venetian hands. This was not a system built for abundance. It was a system built for scarcity, constrained at every turn by geography, by the sheer distance separating northern European kitchens from the fields where cane actually grew, by the number of hands a single loaf of sugar had to pass through before reaching its final buyer, and by the risk, cost, and time involved in moving anything at all across the medieval world. For sugar to ever become something more than an occasional luxury, glimpsed only by the wealthiest and most powerful, something fundamental would need to change. And that change would need to solve a problem no amount of royal wealth or Venetian ambition had managed to solve in all the centuries this system had already existed. Someone, somewhere, would need to find a way around the climate itself, a way to grow this demanding tropical plant somewhere far closer to European hands, free from Venice's tight grip and the long, expensive journey from the eastern Mediterranean. That solution was still generations away, hidden somewhere in a future none of these medieval merchants, physicians, or kings could have possibly imagined. But the first faint stirrings of it were already beginning, far to the west, along the Atlantic coast of a small, ambitious kingdom that was about to look out at the ocean and see, for the first time, real possibility. Along the western edge of Europe, a small kingdom sat looking out at an ocean that most of the continent still regarded with a kind of cautious dread. A vast, unknown expanse where sailors whispered of monsters and edges of the world from which no ship returned. Portugal, however, a small kingdom squeezed against the Atlantic with limited farmland and even more limited influence over the overland trade routes that enriched its larger neighbors, looked at that same ocean and saw something different entirely. Opportunity. Throughout the 1400s, Portuguese sailors, backed by ambitious sponsors and driven by a hunger for new trade routes that did not depend on Venice or the overland paths controlled by rival powers, began pushing steadily down the western coast of Africa, further than any European ships had dared travel before. Along the way, and scattered out into the surrounding Atlantic, they encountered a string of islands that history would remember for reasons far beyond simple exploration. Madeira, the Canary Islands, and, further south, closer to the African coast itself, an island called São Tomé, to most eyes, uninhabited or sparsely populated, distant, and difficult to reach. These islands might have seemed like nothing more than convenient stopping points, useful for resupplying ships on longer voyages down the African coast. But Portuguese settlers looked more closely, and what they noticed would change the course of world history. These islands were warm. They were humid. They sat close enough to the equator to enjoy something northern Europe could never offer: real, consistent tropical heat, paired with fertile volcanic soil and reliable rainfall. In other words, without anyone fully realizing, in that early moment, the weight of what they were looking at, Portugal had stumbled onto something Europe had wanted for centuries, ever since Crusaders first carried sugar home from the Levant, and never quite managed to secure for itself: a place under direct European control, where sugarcane could actually grow. Portuguese planters moved quickly, sensing exactly what kind of opportunity had landed in their hands. They cleared forest and scrubland, diverted streams for irrigation, planted cane in neat, deliberate rows, and established what became, in effect, the very first European-controlled sugar plantations anywhere in the world, owned outright by European colonizers rather than simply purchased through a distant middleman. This was different from anything that had come before it in one crucial respect. Sicily and southern Spain had grown sugar under Arab rule, within an already established Islamic agricultural and irrigation tradition built up over centuries. This was something new entirely. European colonizers, operating on newly claimed Atlantic territory, building a sugar industry from the ground up, under their own direct authority, answerable to no one but themselves. And almost immediately, they ran into a problem that anyone familiar with the crop's history could have predicted, though few at the time seemed prepared for just how severe it would prove to be. Sugarcane cultivation is brutal work. It has always been brutal work. Ever since the first Indian farmers began cutting stalks by hand thousands of years earlier, and nothing about moving the crop onto a new continent made that underlying reality any gentler. The cane must be cut quickly, often with heavy blades, under blazing tropical sun. It must be hauled swiftly to processing before the cut juice spoils. It must be crushed and boiled, hour after hour, in conditions of extreme heat that few laborers could sustain for long stretches without collapsing from exhaustion. Portuguese planters initially attempted to staff these new plantations with European convicts, men sent to the islands as a form of punishment rather than by choice, and with poor European laborers desperate enough for work to accept whatever harsh conditions plantation owners offered them, it did not last. The labor was simply too punishing, the death and injury toll too severe, the supply of willing or coercible European workers too limited to sustain an industry planters hoped to expand rapidly. Something had to change if these new Atlantic plantations were going to produce sugar at anywhere near the scale their owners now imagined possible, a scale far beyond what any earlier sugar-producing region had ever attempted. And so Portugal turned to a source of labor that would ultimately reshape the modern world in ways almost impossible to overstate. Enslaved Africans. The sugar plantations of São Tomé, in particular, became, in a very real and deeply troubling sense, a testing ground, a place where European planters worked out the brutal logistics of large-scale plantation slavery for the very first time. Every terrible element that would later define slavery across the Americas on a vastly larger, more industrialized scale first took shape here, worked out through trial and error, on this relatively small island off the African coast. The forced transportation of enslaved people, the organization of large labor forces around a single cash crop, the calculated cruelty of treating human beings as expendable units of production, worked without regard for their survival, because more captives could always, in the planter's cold economic logic, be acquired to replace those who died. This is not a comfortable part of the story, and it should not be softened or rushed past. What happened on São Tomé was not an unfortunate footnote, easily separated from the rest of sugar's history. It was the template, the working model, quietly worked out and perfected on a small Atlantic island long before it was ever unleashed on a vastly larger stage, across an entire hemisphere. And that larger stage was closer than anyone on those islands could have possibly known. In the year 1492, a Genoese navigator sailing under the flag of Spain set out across the Atlantic Ocean on a voyage that would change the world forever. Though not, as it turned out, for the reasons he initially imagined. Christopher Columbus, convinced he could reach Asia by sailing west across open ocean, instead encountered an entirely unknown landmass, one that would come to be called the Americas, a discovery that would reshape trade, empire, and the map of the known world within a single generation. His first voyage made history on its own, but it was his second voyage that mattered most for the story we are telling tonight, because on that return trip across the Atlantic, Columbus carried with him sugarcane cuttings, taken directly from those same Atlantic island plantations Portugal had spent decades developing. He planted them in the soil of the Caribbean, alongside crops brought from Europe, an experiment, among many others, he carried out on that voyage. And almost immediately, it became clear that something remarkable, something historians would spend centuries trying to fully reckon with, had happened. The climate here was, if anything, even more ideal than the Atlantic islands had been. The soil was rich. The rainfall was generous. Every single condition sugarcane needed to thrive existed here in genuine, staggering abundance, spread across islands and coastlines far larger than anything Portugal's small Atlantic holdings could ever hope to offer. An entire hemisphere of land waiting, as far as European planters were concerned, to be turned into cane fields. Think, for a moment, about the sheer scale of the journey this single plant had just completed, a journey no one alive at any point along the way could have possibly tracked from beginning to end. 10,000 years earlier, it had been nothing more than a wild grass growing quietly in a jungle in New Guinea, tasted for the very first time by hunter-gatherers who could never have imagined where its story would eventually lead. It had drifted island by island across the Pacific with early seafarers who never wrote its story down. It had crossed oceans and continents, been reinvented as a solid by ancient Indian farmers, refined into a genuine industry by Arab scholars and engineers, obsessed over and locked away by medieval European kings and apothecaries, and now, finally, it had crossed the widest ocean of all, carried quietly in the hold of a Spanish ship, about to take root in soil perfectly suited to its needs. on the far side of the entire world from where its story first began. Nothing about what came next would happen slowly, and almost nothing about it would happen gently. The sugar that had once been sealed behind apothecary counters, treated like medicine, tracked like gold, was about to become abundant in a way Europe had never imagined possible. But that abundance would come at a human cost almost too vast to fully comprehend, a cost that the brutal proving ground of São Tomé had already, quietly and terribly, shown the world exactly how to pay, and exactly how to justify. To understand what happened next, in the Caribbean, across the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, it helps to walk through the actual physical process of making sugar during this era, step by step, because the process itself explains, more clearly than almost anything else, why this particular crop became bound so tightly and so tragically to slavery. It began in the fields, under a punishing tropical sun, where enslaved workers cut cane by hand using heavy, sharpened blades called machetes. This alone was exhausting, dangerous labor, performed for hour after hour in searing heat, humidity thick enough to make every breath feel like effort, swinging a blade again and again through tough, fibrous stalks until the body simply refused to give any more. But cutting the cane was only the beginning of a race against time. Because sugarcane juice begins to spoil almost immediately after the stalk is cut, there was no room for delay, no possibility of resting once cutting was finished. The cane had to be gathered and rushed to the mill within hours, loaded onto carts or carried by hand, moving as quickly as exhausted, overworked bodies could manage. Because every hour of delay meant lost sugar, and lost sugar meant lost profit for the men who owned the land, the mill, and the people doing the cutting. At the mill, the danger only intensified. Workers fed the cut stalks into massive grinding rollers, usually powered by oxen, by water, or later by wind, machines that operated with tremendous, unforgiving force, and that ran constantly during the harvest season, day and night, without pause. Feeding cane into these rollers by hand was a job that demanded absolute precision and constant vigilance, because a moment of exhaustion, a slip of the hand, a single lapse in attention after endless hours of grueling labor could mean disaster. Fingers, hands, entire arms could be pulled into the rollers in an instant, crushed beyond saving, and this danger was so well understood, so routinely anticipated by plantation owners, that many mills kept hatchets stationed within arm's reach specifically for this purpose, so that a limb caught in the machinery could be severed quickly, before the rest of the worker's body was dragged through the rollers as well. Agrim, practiced emergency response repeated often enough that it needed no explanation to anyone working the mill. Sit with that detail for a moment, because it says something important about the entire system. Plantation owners did not merely tolerate this risk as an unfortunate accident of the work. They planned for it, budgeted for it, prepared for it in advance, treated maiming and death as an ordinary, expected, almost routine part of every single harvest season. Once the juice had been extracted, the work moved into what plantation workers called the boiling house. And if the fields and the mill were brutal, the boiling house was something closer to an inferno. Rows of massive copper kettles sat over roaring open fires, each one hotter than the last, arranged so that juice could be transferred progressively from kettle to kettle as it thickened and reduced. Temperatures inside these boiling houses regularly exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit. an almost unbearable heat made worse by the humidity of the Caribbean climate and the proximity of open flame. Workers stood for hours beside these enormous kettles, stirring constantly, skimming impurities from the surface, monitoring the boil with practiced, exhausted eyes, constantly at risk of severe burns from splashing molten sugar, a substance that clings to skin and scalds far worse than ordinary boiling water, leaving injuries that could take weeks to heal, if they healed cleanly at all. And during harvest season, this work never stopped. Not for nightfall, not for exhaustion, not for anything short of the harvest itself finally ending. The boiling house operated around the clock, shift after shift, week after week, because once cane juice began its journey toward crystallization, the process could not simply be paused and resumed later at someone's convenience. The fires had to keep burning, the kettles had to keep boiling, and exhausted human beings had to keep standing beside them, night after night, until the season finally released them, if it released them at all. This was the machine that European colonial powers were racing to build across an entire hemisphere. Spain moved first, followed quickly by Portugal, and then, as the profits flowing back across the Atlantic became simply impossible for any rival power to ignore, by England, France, and the Netherlands as well, each one scrambling, often violently, to claim and defend its own sugar colonies across the Caribbean and along the coast of South America, Barbados, Jamaica, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which we know today as Haiti, Cuba, Brazil, on an even larger continental scale, island after island, coastline after coastline, transformed almost entirely into what amounted to enormous, sprawling sugar factories, every available acre cleared, planted, and turned toward a single, relentless purpose. With almost nothing left over for growing food or anything else, a community might actually need to sustain itself locally. The scale this entire system reached in remarkably short order, spreading across island after island within just a few generations, is genuinely difficult to comprehend from where we sit today. Consider Barbados alone, a small island, smaller in land area than a modest American city like San Antonio. Texas, so small you could walk across parts of it in a single day. And yet, by the 1650s, this single small island was producing more sugar than the entire massive territory of Brazil, Barbados, became. In fact, the single most economically valuable colony anywhere in the British Empire, worth more to the Crown than every one of its North American colonies combined. Pause on that for a moment, and let it fully register. All of British North America. Every colony, from Massachusetts down to Georgia, all of what would eventually become the United States of America, was, from a purely economic standpoint, worth less to the British Crown than this one small Caribbean island. Covered edge to edge in cane fields, mills, and boiling houses. But behind every ton of sugar shipped back to Europe from these islands sat an almost unfathomable human cost, one that deserves to be stated plainly and without softening. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, historians estimate that roughly 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forced onto ships and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. A staggering share of them were destined specifically for sugar plantations across the Caribbean and Brazil, because sugar, more than any other single crop grown anywhere in the Americas during this period, was the engine driving demand for this forced, brutal labor system. The conditions these enslaved workers faced, from the moment they stepped off the ship to the years spent in the fields and mills and boiling houses that followed, were so severe, so relentlessly punishing, that the average life expectancy after arrival on a Caribbean sugar plantation was estimated at only about 7 years. 7 years. Say that number again, slowly. Not 7 years of ordinary hardship, difficult but survivable, but 7 years, on average, before exhaustion, injury, disease. And the sheer relentless brutality of the work claimed another life, and the entire grim cycle began again with someone new. And this was not simply an unfortunate byproduct of the system. Plantation owners understood the mathematics involved with cold, deliberate precision. It was, according to their own calculations, cheaper to work enslaved people to the point of death and then purchase replacements than it was to provide the food, rest, and basic humane conditions that might have extended their lives. Human beings were treated, in the coldest possible economic terms, as a consumable input, tracked in plantation account books alongside firewood, tools, and replacement parts for the grinding mill. Their deaths recorded not as tragedies, but as routine costs of doing business, to be offset by the next shipment of captives arriving from across the ocean. This brings us to something that deserves to be said clearly and directly, without hedging, because it is easy, even now, centuries later, to soften this connection into something gentler and more comfortable than the truth actually demands. Sugar did not simply benefit from slavery, the way one industry might benefit from a favorable trade policy. Sugar drove slavery. It was the central economic engine powering the entire transatlantic slave trade. The primary reason so vast and so brutal a system of forced human transport was built and sustained across 3 centuries. Other crops, cotton and tobacco among them, would later depend heavily on enslaved labor as well, and would go on to shape their own dark chapters of American history. But sugar came first, chronologically and economically, and sugar, more than any other single commodity traded across the Atlantic, is the reason this system of forced human transport existed at the staggering scale it eventually reached. This entire brutal economy operated as a closed loop, one that historians often call the triangle trade. European ships carried manufactured goods, textile, weapons, tools, across the Atlantic to the coast of West Africa. There, those goods were traded for captured human beings, torn from their homes and communities, then forced onto ships and carried across the Atlantic to the Caribbean under conditions so horrific that this leg of the journey earned its own grim, enduring name: the Middle Passage. In the Caribbean, those same ships were loaded once more, this time with sugar, molasses, and rum, all of it produced through the forced, exhausting labor of those who had survived the crossing, and carried back across the Atlantic one final time toward European ports, completing the circuit. Every single leg of this triangle generated profit for someone, and often generated profit several times over as goods and captives and sugar changed hands along the way, and every one of those profits flowed, sooner or later, back into Europe, funding grand mansions rising in London and Paris, financing powerful navies that patrolled the very trade routes, making their owners rich, underwriting wars fought for territory and influence far beyond the Caribbean itself. It is difficult to find a corner of 18th century European wealth and power that does not, if you trace it back far enough, run through a sugar plantation somewhere in the Caribbean. If you are finding this story compelling so far, consider subscribing, because we still have a long way left to travel together tonight. and the story only grows larger from here. Nowhere was the reach of this system more visible than in England itself, measured simply in how much sugar ordinary people were consuming. Around the year 1700, the average English person consumed something close to 4 pounds of sugar per year. Still a meaningful amount, but far from an everyday staple. By the year 1800, that number had climbed to roughly 18 pounds per year, a more than fourfold increase within a single century. Sugar had transformed, in the space of a single century, from an occasional luxury glimpsed mainly at royal banquets into something the growing English middle class had come to expect, almost to demand, as an ordinary, unremarkable part of daily life, stirred into tea without a second thought. This shift did not happen by accident, and it is worth pausing to notice that British merchants and politicians, whose fortunes were directly tied to the profitability of these Caribbean colonies, actively encouraged rising sugar consumption, understanding perfectly well that every additional pound consumed at home meant additional profit flowing back from the plantations abroad. The machine that had begun with a single cut stalk of cane in a Caribbean field, processed through grinding mills that could tear off a limb in an instant, and boiling houses hot enough to scald flesh through splashed sugar alone, had grown, within the span of just a couple of centuries, into something vast enough to reshape the everyday habits of an entire nation. 1 teaspoon, 1 sweetened cup of tea, at a time. And this was only the beginning, because the very system that had made all of this wealth possible was about to collide, violently and unexpectedly, with the very people it had spent so long grinding down. Of all the sugar colonies scattered across the Caribbean, one stood apart from all the rest in sheer wealth and productivity: the French colony of Saint-Domingue, occupying the western third of the island we now call Hispaniola, had become, by the late 1700s, the single richest colony anywhere in the world. Its plantations produced more sugar than all the British Caribbean islands combined, generating fortunes so vast they helped fund the glittering excess of the French royal court itself, the powdered wigs, the palaces, the endless entertainments at Versailles, all resting, ultimately, on cane fields worked by enslaved hands an ocean away. But wealth of this magnitude, extracted through a system this brutal and this relentless, does not simply accumulate quietly forever, sitting undisturbed in ledgers and treasuries. It builds pressure, slowly and invisibly at first. Year after year, in the fields and mills where enslaved workers endured conditions even harsher than those found on many other already brutal Caribbean islands. Driven by planters determined to extract every possible ounce of profit from what had become the single most lucrative colony on earth. The very success of Saint-Domingue, the sheer scale of the wealth it generated, meant the exploitation required to sustain that wealth grew correspondingly more extreme with each passing decade. Saint-Domingue was, in every meaningful sense, a tinderbox stacked ever higher with each passing harvest. And it needed only a spark to bring the entire structure down. That spark, when it finally came, arrived in the year 1791, and it arrived with a force few in Europe had thought possible. Enslaved workers across Saint-Domingue rose up in a coordinated, sustained uprising unlike anything the plantation world had ever witnessed. They burned plantations to the ground. The very cane fields and boiling houses that had extracted their labor and consumed their lives for generations, turning the machinery of their own oppression into ash and smoke. What began as an uprising quickly became something far larger and far more consequential. A full-scale revolutionary war that would stretch on for 12 grinding years, fought against the combined military forces of France, Spain, and Britain, three of the most powerful empires on earth at the time, each one attempting, at different points along the way, to reclaim or seize this staggeringly valuable colony for itself, sending fleets and armies across the Atlantic in the hope of restoring the old order, the old plantations, and the old profits that had once made this island the envy of every colonial power in Europe, and against every expectation held by those watching anxiously from Europe, expectations built on centuries of assumed European military superiority, the formerly enslaved people of Saint-Domingue won. In the year 1804, they declared their independence, and in doing so, they accomplished something that had never happened before in recorded history and has never been repeated since at anywhere near this scale. It remains, to this day, the only successful large-scale slave revolt in recorded human history, a fact worth sitting with for a moment. Given just how many systems of slavery have existed across so many centuries and civilizations, the new nation took the name Haiti, and it became the very first free black republic anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, a nation whose very existence stood as living proof that the sugar economy's most brutal assumptions could be broken, defied, and ultimately overthrown by the very people it had sought to consume entirely. The shockwaves from this revolution did not stay contained to the Caribbean. They rippled outward across the Atlantic and struck at the very heart of French imperial ambition. France had just lost its single most profitable colony. Overnight, in the most complete and humiliating way imaginable, a wound to both the French treasury and French imperial pride that would echo for years afterward. And for Napoleon Bonaparte, who by this point had risen to power in France and harbored genuine dreams of building a sprawling empire across the Americas. This loss was catastrophic. Saint-Domingue had been intended as the crown jewel, the economic engine anchoring a much larger French presence, stretching across the Caribbean and into the heart of North America. Without it, that entire vision simply collapsed. This is where sugar's story quietly reshapes the map of an entire continent. In a chain of cause and effect so long and so indirect that most people who study this next event in school never once learn to connect it back to a burning cane field in the Caribbean. Napoleon had also acquired the vast Louisiana Territory, an enormous stretch of land in North America, originally intended to serve as a breadbasket and strategic support base for his Caribbean sugar empire, feeding and supplying the plantations that would generate the wealth his broader ambitions depended on. But with Saint-Domingue lost and that sugar empire in ruins, holding on to Louisiana no longer made any real strategic sense. It was, in the wake of Haiti's independence, simply an enormous, expensive territory with no clear strategic purpose left to serve. A piece on the map that no longer connected to anything Napoleon still actually controlled. And so, in the year 1803, Napoleon made a decision that would alter the future of an entire continent. He sold the Louisiana Territory to the young United States for roughly $15 million, a price that worked out to something close to 4 cents an acre, a sale that, almost overnight, doubled the entire size of the young American nation and reshaped the future course of an entire continent. Sugar's collapse in Haiti had, quite literally, doubled the size of the United States. One of the most consequential real estate transactions in human history, set in motion not by American diplomacy or French generosity, but by enslaved sugar workers who burned their own plantations to the ground on a Caribbean island thousands of miles away. Even as this economic disaster unfolded in the Caribbean, Napoleon faced another sugar-related problem entirely. This one much closer to home: Britain's powerful Royal Navy had thrown a tight blockade around French ports, cutting off Napoleonic France from its remaining Caribbean sugar supplies almost entirely. Wealthy French households, accustomed to a sweetness that had defined European luxury for the better part of 1,000 years, suddenly found that sweetness cut off at the source. Ships unable to slip past British warships patrolling the Channel and the Atlantic approaches to French ports, France needed sugar, and with the traditional tropical supply chain effectively severed by British warships, it needed an entirely new solution, and needed it quickly. Something Europe could grow, harvest, and refine entirely on its own soil, free from the reach of any foreign navy. The answer had actually been sitting quietly in scientific literature for decades already, waiting for the right moment and the right motivation to be taken seriously. A German chemist named Andreas Marggraf had discovered, years earlier, that ordinary European sugar beets, a humble root vegetable growing across temperate farmland, contained sucrose chemically identical to what was extracted from tropical sugarcane. At the time of Marggraf's discovery, decades earlier, it had remained mostly a scientific curiosity, filed away in academic journals, interesting but commercially untested, because no one had yet built the infrastructure, developed the extraction techniques, or found sufficient motivation to pursue sugar from beets at any meaningful commercial scale. Cane sugar was still flowing freely enough that beets seemed, to most observers, like an interesting laboratory footnote rather than a genuine industry. Napoleon changed that almost overnight. He poured state resources directly into beet sugar production, establishing dedicated research institutions specifically tasked with improving cultivation techniques and refining processes for this new domestic sugar source. He ordered tens of thousands of acres across French farmland converted to sugar beet cultivation, and he offered cash bounties to farmers willing to make the switch away from traditional grain crops. This was not a modest experiment, some tentative pilot program tucked away in a quiet corner of the French countryside, easily abandoned if early results disappointed. It was a full-scale, state-directed industrial push, driven by genuine imperial necessity and backed by the full authority and resources of the French state itself. Treated with the same seriousness Napoleon brought to his military campaigns, and, against considerable odds, it worked. By the year 1813, unquote, France was producing millions of pounds of beet sugar annually. Refineries and processing facilities springing up across regions that had never before had any connection whatsoever to sugar production. An achievement that would have seemed almost impossible, even faintly absurd, to anyone assessing the situation only a decade earlier. For the first time in the entire 10,000-year history we have been tracing together tonight, sugar's ancient, seemingly unshakable dependence on tropical climates, on cane fields stretching from India through Persia and the Islamic world all the way to the Caribbean, had been genuinely, permanently broken. Europe could now grow its own sugar, on its own cool, temperate soil, in fields that looked nothing like a Caribbean plantation, without depending on a single tropical colony, a single ocean crossing, or a single enslaved worker cutting cane beneath a distant equatorial sun. The plant itself was different, the climate was different, and yet the sweetness at the end of the process was, chemically, exactly the same substance that had traveled so far and cost so much to reach European tables for centuries. This breakthrough set the stage for a rivalry that would define sugar's story for the following century. Cane against beet, tropical colony against temperate European farmland, each side competing fiercely for market share. each side driving prices steadily lower as producers on both sides of the divide fought for dominance in a market that, for the very first time, had genuine alternatives to choose between. That competition, born directly out of a slave revolt on a Caribbean island and a naval blockade off the coast of Europe, two events that seemed to have nothing to do with each other at the time, was about to transform sugar from the rare, carefully guarded luxury it had remained for nearly the entirety of recorded human history into something entirely different. Something ordinary working people everywhere would soon be able to afford, and eventually expect. In quantities no medieval king locked away behind his own treasury doors could ever have imagined possible. With cane and beet now competing directly against each other for the first time in sugar's entire 10,000-year history, two very different agricultural traditions suddenly forced into open rivalry across the very same European markets. Something inevitable began to happen across the 19th century. Prices fell, and kept falling, year after year, decade after decade, as producers on both sides of this new rivalry pushed relentlessly to expand output, improve efficiency, and undercut one another for a growing share of an increasingly hungry market. Sugar, which had spent nearly the whole of recorded human history as something rare, closely guarded, and reserved for the wealthy, was entering an era of genuine abundance for the very first time. A shift so significant it would eventually touch nearly every kitchen table on Earth. And this shift did not happen in isolation. It collided directly with one of the most transformative periods in human history, the Industrial Revolution. And the collision between these two forces reshaped sugar production almost beyond recognition. For thousands of years, stretching all the way back to the earliest Indian farmers pressing stalks by hand, crushing cane had depended on the muscle of animals, the flow of water, or, when nothing else was available, the strength of exhausted human hands turning heavy rollers hour after hour. Now steam power entered the picture, hissing and pounding its way into sugar mills across the world. And everything changed almost at once. Steam-driven mills could crush cane far faster and far more efficiently than any ox, water wheel, or exhausted human laborer ever had managed across thousands of years of sugar production. Processing enormous quantities of harvested cane in a fraction of the time earlier generations would have required, and doing so with a tireless, mechanical consistency no living creature could match. Railroads transformed the logistics of the entire sugar industry just as dramatically as steam power had transformed the mills themselves. Where raw cane had once traveled from field to mill by cart, racing against spoilage over rutted roads that might take an entire day or more to traverse, railroads could now move that same cane from field to factory in a matter of hours instead, dramatically expanding how far a plantation could realistically operate from its processing facility, and how much freshly cut cane could reach the mill before its juice began to spoil in the tropical heat. Refining technology advanced right alongside these mechanical improvements, producers developing new filtration and crystallization techniques, new bleaching and clarifying agents that could strip away impurities more thoroughly than any earlier method had managed, until the final product emerged bright, clean, and dazzlingly white, a far cry from the rough, brownish, coarsely crystallized sugar that had defined the substance for nearly all of its long, winding history. That whiteness, interestingly enough, took on a cultural weight all its own, one that had very little to do with taste and quite a lot to do with appearances. Pure white sugar became a symbol of purity and modernity, something refined, clean, and desirable in the eyes of the growing middle class, while old-fashioned brown sugar, despite being functionally quite similar and arguably richer in trace minerals left behind by less intensive refining, quietly came to be seen as somehow inferior, a lesser product suited only for those who could not afford, or did not know to ask for. The finer, whiter alternative sitting on the same shelf. Sugar's color had become a marker of status all its own, a small, quiet echo of the days when possessing any sugar at all marked a person as wealthy, even as the substance itself grew steadily more available to people who, a single century earlier, could never have dreamed of tasting it, let alone choosing between shades of it. And it was during this period that one particular cultural pairing emerged that would define working-class life across Britain, and eventually much of the industrialized world, for generations to come. Tea. Britain had been importing enormous quantities of tea from China for decades already. Ships arriving regularly at English ports loaded with a beverage that had already become deeply woven into national identity. But tea, left entirely on its own, is a genuinely bitter drink. An acquired taste that many ordinary working people simply did not enjoy without some way to soften its sharp edge and make it genuinely pleasant to drink after a long day. Sugar provided exactly that softening, transforming an austere, faintly bitter beverage into something warm, comforting, and genuinely pleasurable to drink, even after a long, grueling shift spent standing at a factory floor or hauling coal. A small, affordable moment of comfort in an otherwise exhausting day. The numbers from this period tell their own vivid, unmistakable story. British sugar imports roughly doubled between 1840 and 1860, a staggering increase compressed into just 2 decades, reflecting a nation rapidly developing a taste, and then a dependency, on sweetened tea as an everyday ritual. And this was not simply a matter of changing personal preference drifting organically through the population. The British government actively lowered tariffs on sugar imports during this period, and it did so quite deliberately, with the explicit goal of keeping sweetened tea cheap and accessible enough that working-class families could afford it as a routine part of daily life. Officials of the era spoke openly and without much embarrassment about wanting the working population kept, in their own words, fed and productive. And cheap sweetened tea fit that goal perfectly, offering a low-cost way to keep an entire industrial workforce functioning. There was, beneath this seemingly benevolent policy, a colder industrial logic quietly at work. Sugar offered something factory owners found extraordinarily useful: cheap, fast calories that could keep an exhausted worker moving through a 12 to 14-hour shift without requiring the employer to provide anything resembling a substantial, nourishing meal. A cup of heavily sweetened tea and a slice of bread spread with jam delivered a quick, dependable burst of energy at minimal cost. Letting factory owners and industrialists keep their workforce functioning through brutally long working days on the cheapest possible fuel available anywhere in the industrial economy. Sugar had, in a very real and rarely acknowledged sense, become the fuel of industrial capitalism itself, quietly powering the factories, mills, and workshops that were reshaping the entire economic landscape of the 19th century. One cheap, sweetened calorie at a time, an ingredient hiding in plain sight behind every long shift and every smoking chimney. From this foundation of cheap sugar and sweetened tea, sugar spread rapidly and steadily into every corner of the working-class diet across Western Europe and, before long, across North America as well, embedding itself into meals and habits that had, only a generation or two earlier, contained almost no sugar at all. Jams, thick with preserved fruit and sugar, cheap to produce at scale and able to stretch a small harvest of fruit across an entire winter. Candies. An entirely new category of affordable indulgence. Small and inexpensive enough to be available to people who had never before had access to sweets of any kind in their entire lives. Baked goods. Sweetened bread and biscuits that stretched a family's modest food budget while still providing a genuine sense of small, everyday pleasure at the end of a hard day. Sweetened drinks of every kind. Cordials. Limonades. And early carbonated beverages, all finding a ready and growing market among people eager for an affordable, dependable little pleasure. By the late 1800s, sugar was no longer the rare, locked-away luxury it had been for most of recorded human history, guarded behind apothecary counters and displayed as a symbol of royal wealth. It had become, for the very first time ever, a genuine staple of ordinary daily life for millions of working people across 2 entire continents. Something reached for without hesitation or ceremony. Morning after morning, cup after cup, even as this quiet domestic transformation unfolded across kitchens and factory floors, sugar continued shaping geopolitics on a truly global scale. This time reaching all the way out into the Pacific and back into the Caribbean once again. In the Hawaiian Islands, American planters had spent decades building an enormous, immensely profitable sugar plantation economy. Cane fields spreading across fertile volcanic soil under a tropical sun, far more forgiving than anything the American mainland could offer. By the 1890s, these planters had accumulated significant political power on the islands. Power they were entirely willing to use when their profits felt threatened. In 1893, with direct backing from United States Marines landed from a naval vessel anchored offshore, these American planters overthrew Queen Liliuokalani, the reigning Hawaiian monarch, in a coup driven substantially by their desire to protect sugar profits and secure favorable tariff treatment for their exports to the American mainland, a treatment recent tariff changes had put at serious risk. Just 5 years later, in 1898, the United States formally annexed Hawaii outright, folding the islands into American territory. A decision shaped significantly by sugar interests and the tangled, often self-serving tariff politics surrounding their trade with the mainland. That very same year, 1898, brought sugar geopolitics right back to the Caribbean as well, the region where this entire brutal chapter of sugar's history had first taken root centuries earlier. The Spanish-American War delivered Cuba, already one of the world's most significant sugar-producing territories, firmly into the American economic orbit. A relationship formalized soon after through the Platt Amendment, which granted the United States substantial ongoing influence over Cuban affairs, protecting, among other things, the American commercial and sugar interests already deeply embedded on the island. Sugar. In other words, he had traveled an almost unbelievable distance by the close of the 19th century, further in some ways than it had traveled in all the centuries that came before. It had gone from a substance locked behind apothecary counters and jealously guarded treasury doors, to an ingredient-shaping empire, revolution, war, and international diplomacy on multiple continents. And now, finally, to something sitting casually, almost thoughtlessly, on the breakfast table of ordinary families across Europe and America, stirred into tea without anyone pausing to consider its extraordinary history. And yet, remarkably, its transformation was still nowhere near complete. Something entirely new was coming, waiting just over the horizon of the new century about to begin. Something that would take this already ubiquitous substance and turn it into a genuine mass-market phenomenon. Branded, bottled, advertised, and sold in ways no century before it had ever imagined possible, carrying sugar into homes and habits on a scale that would have astonished even the busiest Venetian merchant or the wealthiest sugar planter of centuries past. In the year 1886, in a small pharmacy in Atlanta, Georgia, a pharmacist stood behind his counter and mixed together a syrup that would go on to become one of the single most recognized products in the entire history of the world, though nobody standing in that pharmacy that day could possibly have guessed it. He called it Coca-Cola, and though it began humbly, sold by the glass at a marble soda fountain counter to curious customers who had never tasted anything quite like it, it would not stay small for long. Within just a few years, Coca-Cola had grown from a local curiosity into a genuine mass-market sensation, bottled in distinctive glass, distributed across an ever-widening network of stores and fountains, and advertised on a scale no sweetened beverage anywhere in the world had ever achieved before. And where Coca-Cola led, as it so often does in the history of any wildly successful product, competitors quickly followed, eager to claim their own slice of this suddenly lucrative new market. Rival soda companies sprang up across the country, each one racing to capture a share of this suddenly booming market for sweet, fizzy, sugar-laden drinks. Candy bars soon joined the shelves alongside them, individually wrapped, mass-produced on assembly lines that would have seemed like pure science fiction to an ancient Indian farmer boiling cane juice over an open fire, and priced cheaply enough for almost anyone to afford a small daily indulgence without a second thought. And breakfast itself, once a simple, largely unsweetened affair built around plain oats and porridge, spooned into a bowl without much thought of pleasure, transformed as well, as cereal companies began coating their products in sugar, turning the first meal of the day into yet another opportunity for sweetness. Marketed cheerfully to children on television screens across the country, consumption climbed steadily and consistently through the early decades of the 20th century, following a trajectory that would have utterly astonished anyone living just 100 years earlier. Back in an era when a single pound of sugar could cost an ordinary laborer close to an entire month's wages, sealed carefully behind a locked apothecary counter. But this steady climb, this seemingly unstoppable march toward ever greater sugar consumption, was about to hit a genuine, jarring interruption, one driven not by shifting taste, changing fashion, or new scientific discovery, but by something far larger. A world plunged into total war. When the United States entered World War II, sugar became, almost immediately, a casualty of global conflict. In December of 1941, Japan's swift invasion of the Philippines cut the United States off entirely and abruptly from a major source of imported sugar, one American households had come to rely on without a second thought. Shipping routes from Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and other Caribbean sources faced their own serious disruptions as well. Threatened by naval conflict in the Pacific, by the very real risk of enemy attack, and by the diversion of cargo vessels away from ordinary trade and toward the war effort itself. Faced with a genuine, unavoidable shortage that no amount of domestic production could fully make up, the United States government made sugar the very first food item rationed nationwide, beginning in May of 1942, well before meat, coffee, or any other everyday necessity. Ordinary Americans, only recently accustomed to sugar as an unremarkable, always available staple, adapted to an entirely new reality almost overnight, Families registered at local schools to receive ration books, each one carefully allotted based on household size and need. Administered by local boards, staffed largely by volunteers and neighbors, every single purchase of sugar required surrendering a ration stamp along with payment. A small but constant, almost ritualistic daily reminder that this once ordinary staple had become, once again, a genuinely scarce and carefully managed resource, echoing, in its own strange way, the tightly controlled sugar of medieval European courts centuries earlier. And the scarcity lingered far longer than most Americans probably expected. While most wartime rationing ended shortly after the war, concluded in 1945, sugar rationing persisted in parts of the country all the way until 1947, making it both the very first food rationed during the war and, remarkably, the very last to finally be set free. Once that long, carefully rationed scarcity finally lifted. Though, American sugar consumption did not simply return quietly to its pre-war levels and settle there. It surged instead, climbing steadily and relentlessly through the post-war decades, fueled by growing prosperity, an explosion of newly available processed and convenience foods. Suburban supermarkets stocked floor to ceiling, and a rapidly expanding array of sweetened products flooding grocery store shelves in a country eager to move past years of wartime scarcity. By the year 1970, the average American was consuming over 100 pounds of sugar annually. Stop and consider that figure for a moment. Really let it sink in. 100 pounds. That is roughly the weight of a fully grown large dog, consumed, quite literally, in sugar alone, by every single man, woman, and child across the country, year after year. And here the story takes a darker, more troubling turn, one that would remain hidden from public view for decades. As early as the 1950s, internal research conducted within the sugar industry itself had already identified genuinely concerning links between sugar consumption and heart disease. This was not vague speculation or uncertain preliminary data buried in some obscure footnote. It was solid enough, consistent enough, that industry insiders understood with real clarity exactly what they were looking at, and exactly what it implied about their own product. But rather than sharing these troubling findings openly with the public, or with the medical community that might have acted on them, the industry made a very different, and far more consequential, choice. In 1967, the Sugar Research Foundation quietly paid 3 scientists at Harvard University a sum equivalent to roughly $50,000 in today's money to produce a scientific review specifically designed to downplay sugar's role in heart disease, and to shift the blame instead, conveniently and deliberately, toward dietary fat. This review was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the single most respected and influential medical publications anywhere in the entire world, lending it an air of scientific authority and independence it never should have carried, given the money quietly sitting behind it. For roughly the next 30 years, this single manufactured conclusion, born from a quiet financial arrangement rather than honest science, shaped nutritional guidance across the United States, in time, much of the wider world. Low-fat diets became the officially recommended standard. Food companies, following this new official guidance in good faith, or at least claiming to, stripped fat out of countless everyday products, and to keep those newly reformulated products tasting appealing enough for consumers to actually buy them, they quietly replaced that missing fat with sugar instead, often in far larger quantities than most shoppers would ever have guessed by reading the label. The consequences of this decades-long deception were nothing short of catastrophic. rates of obesity climbed steadily and visibly across the population, decade after decade. Type 2 diabetes, once a relatively uncommon diagnosis, rarely discussed outside a doctor's office, became alarmingly widespread, touching millions of American families. Heart disease, the very condition this manufactured research had been specifically designed to obscure, continued its rise as one of the leading causes of death in the country, even as official guidance kept pointing the public's attention firmly in the wrong direction. The full truth did not finally come to light until the year 2016. Decades later, when researchers at the University of California, San Francisco, uncovered a substantial trove of internal sugar industry documents, papers that laid bare, in the industry's own internal words, exactly how thoroughly and deliberately science had been manipulated over the years to protect a single, hugely profitable product. Historians and public health researchers studying these newly uncovered documents were quick to draw an unmistakable, almost eerie comparison. This was, in every meaningful sense, the exact same playbook the tobacco industry had used for decades to obscure the health risks of smoking, adapted almost point for point for a very different product sitting in almost every kitchen cabinet in America. Fund research quietly engineered to reach convenient conclusions, manufacture doubt around any inconvenient findings that slip through anyway, attack and discredit outside critics who raise uncomfortable questions, delay meaningful regulation for as long as humanly possible. One review, one committee, one carefully worded statement at a time. And while this particular scandal was quietly unfolding behind closed doors, another significant shift was already reshaping the American sugar supply in a way most consumers never noticed happening at all. In the early 1970s, Japanese scientists developed an efficient industrial process for converting ordinary cornstarch into a cheap, stable liquid sweetener known as high-fructose corn syrup. American corn farmers, already producing far more corn than the domestic market actually needed, thanks in large part to generous government subsidies that encouraged planting well beyond what anyone could reasonably eat, suddenly found themselves with an enormous, ready-made new market for their surplus crop, one that did not require exporting a single kernel overseas. By 1984, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi, the two giants that had once helped drive American sugar consumption to record heights in the first place, had switched from traditional cane sugar to high-fructose corn syrup in their American products, a change driven primarily by simple cost. Since the syrup was considerably cheaper to produce and noticeably easier to transport and blend evenly into liquid beverages than solid cane sugar had ever been, within roughly a single decade, high-fructose corn syrup had quietly replaced cane sugar across an enormous share of the entire American processed food supply, embedded not just in soda, but in bread, condiments, salad dressings, and countless other products where almost no shopper would ever have thought to look for it. And most Americans, reaching for their usual products at the grocery store, had absolutely no idea that the sweetener at the very heart of their diet had fundamentally changed. The sugar that had traveled 10,000 years, crossed every ocean on Earth, survived empires and revolutions and blockades to reach this point, had, quietly and almost entirely without fanfare, been joined by an entirely new kind of sweetness altogether, cheaper, more concentrated, and, as the coming decades would reveal, just as difficult for the average American to escape. Today, sugar no longer needs a royal banquet, a wedding feast, or a treasury inventory to make its presence known in the world. It has found its way into places most people would never think to look. quietly folded into the ordinary architecture of a modern grocery list, sitting on shelves between products that seem, on the surface, to have nothing whatsoever to do with sweetness. Pasta sauce, a savory jar most shoppers would never instinctively associate with sweetness at all, often carries a surprising amount of added sugar folded in to round out its flavor and balance the acidity of the tomatoes. Bread, an everyday staple stretching back thousands of years to some of humanity's very earliest agricultural experiments. Long before anyone anywhere had ever tasted a single crystal of refined sugar, frequently contains sugar as well today, tucked quietly into the ingredient list beneath flour, water, and yeast, an addition its ancient bakers could never have anticipated. Salad dressing, purchased specifically and deliberately by people making a genuine effort to eat healthfully, often hides a meaningful amount of sugar behind its savory, tangy taste. A quiet, almost invisible irony sitting right there beside the fresh vegetables in the produce aisle. Flavored yogurt, marketed and sold with cheerful images of fresh fruit and reassuring words like wholesome and natural printed prominently across the container. Can, in some cases, contain more sugar per ounce than an actual candy bar sitting just a few aisles away in the very same store. And granola bars, wrapped in cheerful packaging covered with images of whole grains, oats, and natural-looking ingredients, frequently deliver a sugar content that would genuinely surprise most people reaching for what they quietly assume, without ever checking the fine print on the label, is a light, sensible, health-forward snack rather than a lightly disguised dessert. This is what nutritionists and public health researchers have come to call the hidden sugar problem. A phrase worth pausing on for a moment here, gently and without any alarm at all, simply to notice how quietly, how thoroughly, and how completely it has settled itself into the ordinary architecture of everyday modern life. Largely unnoticed and rarely questioned. A single can of ordinary soda, entirely on its own, contains something close to a full day's recommended limit of added sugar packed into one drink alone, consumed in the time it takes to finish a short conversation. Not a meaningful portion of that limit, close to the entire thing, consumed in a matter of minutes, often without anyone giving it a second thought, taken together, across an entire ordinary day of otherwise unremarkable eating. Nothing dramatic or excessive by most people's own honest sense of their habits. The average American now consumes something close to double, and in many cases closer to triple, the amount of added sugar recommended by the American Heart Association. This is not typically the result of any single dramatic indulgence, some rare trip to an ice cream parlor or an occasional slice of birthday cake at a celebration. It accumulates quietly instead, meal by meal, snack by snack, spoonful by invisible spoonful, hidden inside products most people never think to associate with sugar at all, the way it once hid, quite differently, behind an apothecary's locked counter. The broader health landscape that has emerged from this decades-long pattern of quiet, accumulated consumption deserves to be stated plainly, calmly, and entirely without unnecessary alarm, because that is simply, honestly, what the accumulated evidence shows when you look at it clearly. Rates of obesity across the population have climbed substantially over recent decades. A slow, steady trend, clearly visible in public health data, stretching back across an entire generation of careful measurement. Type 2 diabetes, along with the closely related condition known as prediabetes, now affects a truly enormous share of the adult population. Far more people than most casual observers would ever guess simply by looking around a crowded room. Until, quite often, they themselves or someone close to them receives the diagnosis, and a distant statistic quietly becomes something deeply personal instead. Heart disease remains, as it has for decades now, stubbornly and consistently, one of the leading causes of death in the country. A grim statistic that has proven remarkably resistant to easy solutions or quick fixes. None of this, it should be said clearly, means sugar alone bears sole responsibility for these health conditions, and it would be a genuine oversimplification of a complicated picture to suggest otherwise. Diet as a whole, physical activity, genetics, sleep, and many other interconnected factors all play meaningful roles as well, woven together in ways researchers are still working to fully untangle. But decades of carefully accumulated research consistently point to sugar, and particularly the quiet, hidden sugar woven so thoroughly into so much of the modern processed food supply, as one significant, well-documented, and genuinely modifiable contributing factor among the several that researchers continue to study. Step back far enough, past any single country's grocery aisles or public health statistics, and the global scale of sugar production and consumption today is almost as staggering as anything else we have traced together throughout this entire 10,000-year story. Worldwide sugar production now exceeds 180 million tons every single year, an almost incomprehensible quantity of pure sweetness. Grown, harvested, crushed, and carefully refined across dozens of countries scattered over every inhabited continent on Earth. When set against the 10,000-year journey of a single wild grass, first tasted almost entirely by accident, deep in a New Guinea jungle by someone whose name history never bothered to record. Brazil stands today as the largest sugar producer anywhere on Earth. Its vast, sprawling modern plantations tracing a direct, unbroken historical line back to those original Portuguese colonial sugar operations established centuries earlier, on soil first cleared, planted, and worked for exactly this same purpose. Generation after generation. India, remarkably and rather beautifully, when you consider the full arc of everything we have traced together tonight, remains a major producer as well. The very same civilization that first invented sugar crystallization thousands of years ago. Still deeply and continuously connected to a craft its ancient farmers pioneered quietly along the banks of its great rivers. Generations before anyone, anywhere, had ever heard the word candy spoken aloud. And average global sugar consumption per person continues climbing steadily and noticeably, year after year, decade after decade, as Western dietary patterns, sweetened beverages, and packaged processed foods spread ever more widely into countries and communities that, only a generation or two ago, consumed comparatively little sugar at all. The same, slow, quiet spread that once carried this plant from a New Guinea jungle across the entire Pacific, only now moving at the speed of global shipping and mass advertising rather than canoes and footpaths. And yet, woven through this otherwise sobering picture, there are genuine signs of hopeful pushback, places where public policy has begun responding thoughtfully to what decades of research have revealed. In the year 2014, Mexico introduced a nationwide tax specifically on sugary soda, a policy that faced considerable pushback and lobbying from beverage companies at the time. And yet, within just the first year alone, researchers documented a measurable, meaningful drop in consumption. Real, concrete evidence that price signals genuinely can shift everyday behavior even at a national scale. The United Kingdom followed several years later. In 2018, with its own sugar levy applied specifically to sweetened beverages. Structured deliberately to reward companies that reduced sugar content rather than simply taxing every product equally. Remarkably, many major drink manufacturers began quietly reformulating their recipes, gradually reducing sugar content across their most popular products, well before that tax even officially took effect, choosing to adapt proactively and avoid the coming cost entirely rather than pass it along to customers. Here in the United States, in the continued absence of any broader national action on the issue, several individual cities have experimented with their own local soda taxes instead, including Berkeley, Philadelphia, and Seattle, each pursuing this policy independently and somewhat courageously, city by city, rather than waiting on a national consensus that has, so far, never quite arrived. Early research emerging from these scattered local experiments suggests genuinely encouraging, hopeful results. Measurable reductions in sugary beverage consumption, specifically within the cities that chose to adopt these taxes, even as the sugar and beverage industry, drawing on considerable financial resources, has continued lobbying hard against similar measures being adopted anywhere else across the country. And so, at last, we arrive, gently and without hurry, at the end of an extraordinarily long and winding journey, one that began 10,000 years ago with a single wild grass growing quietly in a warm, humid jungle in New Guinea, tasted for the very first time by hunter-gatherers who could never, in their wildest imagining, have foreseen where that single, curious bite would eventually lead. From that humble, almost accidental beginning, this one unassuming plant has gone on to touch nearly every major current running through the entire span of human history, weaving itself so thoroughly into our story that it becomes almost impossible to fully separate the two. Migration, carrying it slowly and patiently, generation after generation, island by island, across the vast, open expanse of the Pacific, in the hands of seafarers who left behind no written record of the journey at all, only the plant itself, still growing, still sweet. Medicine, as ancient physicians in India, Persia, and across the wider Islamic world studied it, refined it, and prescribed it with genuine scientific seriousness, treating it as something closer to precious medicine than to an everyday food. Empire, as one European power after another, Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, the Netherlands, built entire colonial systems, fleets, and administrations specifically around controlling its production and its trade across two hemispheres. Slavery, in its darkest and most brutal chapter, a system this single crop helped drive and sustain at a scale human history had never before witnessed, and has thankfully never witnessed again since. Revolution, as enslaved people in Haiti rose up against overwhelming odds and, in doing so, reshaped the map of an entire continent, doubling a young nation's size an ocean away without either side ever fully realizing the connection at the time. Industry, as steam power and railroads transformed sugar from a rare, treasured luxury into an ordinary, everyday staple within the span of a single remarkable century. And now, quietly and in our own present moment, public health, as researchers, doctors, and policymakers continue working to understand and thoughtfully respond to sugar's complicated place in modern diets and modern illness. It is a genuinely remarkable thing, when you take the time to sit with it quietly for a moment, that something this small, this seemingly simple, A plain white crystal dissolved without a second thought into a warm cup of tea or coffee, carries within it such an enormous, sprawling, sometimes beautiful and sometimes deeply painful history. It has, across its long and winding history, been worth more than gold, and, later, cheaper than ordinary sand, sacred medicine locked behind a physician's counter, and later, an ordinary, unremarkable, everyday staple, a cause of revolution on a Caribbean island, and, in the very same era, a quiet, comforting fixture of breakfast tables in homes that never once thought about where it came from. And tonight, as you drift off to sleep, it likely sits somewhere close by in your own home too, tucked quietly into a cabinet, a pantry shelf, or a sugar bowl left out on the counter, carrying within it, without any announcement or ceremony at all, the entire extraordinary 10,000-year story we have just spent this evening together tracing, from a single wild grass in a distant jungle, all the way to here, to this quiet room, to this quiet moment, right beside you. Let us return, one final time, to that quiet English kitchen where we first began this whole evening together. The fire has burned down to a soft, glowing ember. The kettle sits still and silent on the stove, and a tired hand lifts a small spoon once more, stirring sugar slowly into a cup of tea, without a single thought given, in that ordinary moment, to where that small spoonful of sweetness actually came from. We know now, though we know it travelled 10,000 years to reach that cup. A wild grass in a New Guinea jungle, a quiet discovery in an Indian river valley, a caliphate's engineers coaxing it out of arid desert soil, crusaders carrying it home like treasure, Venetian merchants growing rich from its trade, kings displaying it like gold, Portuguese sailors planting it on distant Atlantic islands, enslaved hands cutting it beneath the Caribbean sun, a revolution in Haiti that quietly doubled the size of a young nation an ocean away, a century of steam and rail that turned it from luxury into habit, and, finally, a century of soda bottles, ration books, hidden research, and quiet reckonings, carrying it all the way to tonight, to this spoon, to this cup, to you. It is, when you sit back quietly and take in the whole shape of it, a genuinely enormous story to have followed all the way through together tonight, from a single curious bite of wild cane in a distant jungle, all the way to a spoon stirred gently into a cup of tea. Thank you for staying with it, for letting this long, winding history carry you gently through the night. Before you drift off, let us know once more where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what time it happens to be where you are. It is always a quiet pleasure to imagine so many people, in so many different places, settling in together for a story like this one. And if you enjoyed this journey through the 10,000-year history of sugar, consider subscribing, so you never miss the next long, slow story we tell together. Sleep well, wherever you are tonight. We will